The English language is really an amalgam of several different languages, all thrown on top of its ancient Germanic base. This language mixing was accomplished over successive centuries of invasions, settlements, and resettlements of the English Isles, first by the Celts, then the Romans, the Germanic tribes, the Norse, the French Normans, and many other people groups, all of whom imported aspects of their languages with them. This means that, among other consequences, our words tend to have more synonyms than is normal, because we effectively have dozens of languages from which to pull. If you're in a particularly good mood one day, you might describe yourself with the English glad, the Norse happy, or the French cheerful, the Latin contented, or even the Greek ecstatic. This particular level of flexibility is very much unique to the English language, and it continues to grow more and more flexible even today. Being the modern-day lingua franca in our era of globalized trade, English is now spoken in every country around the world and is influenced by those foreign speakers. Just consider how many Hindi words have found their way into the English language in the recent past. Chutney, cot, avatar, bandana, pajama, dinghy, guru, juggernaut, khaki, mantra, nirvana, shampoo, typhoon, and the list goes on. And this happens with practically every language which has speakers who also speak English. This level of flexibility, this huge toolbox of words from which to choose, while it may be great for writing poetry or for getting across very specific shades of meaning in conversation, also presents a danger. Say, for instance, that people in a town have become fed up with their high taxes and they collectively demand that no new taxes be imposed upon them. Well, now anytime a politician tries to put forward a new idea that uses the word taxes, he will be immediately shut down by the populace of that town. They won't even listen to his pitch, such as their distaste for the idea of new taxes. However, because of some quirk of human psychology perhaps, if the politician were to use a word or phrase other than taxes, community investment for instance, something which was far enough removed from the original idea of taxes, but which still got across the same idea, well then people all of a sudden become much more open to the idea of increased government spending, despite their being so against new taxes. This idea of changing out words which have become toxic and unapproachable for words which convey the exact same ideas, but avoid entirely any of the negative associations already made in people's minds, is what I call a thesaurus argument. And while not necessary to be considered a thesaurus argument, they can be made even more effective by replacing these toxic words with other words which already have positive associations in people's minds. Tell an American that something is pro-freedom, and he'll be much more likely to support it, whatever it is. And while this type of wordplay can of course be done in any language, I think the more synonyms you have available, the more effective and pernicious these thesaurus arguments have the potential to be. Hence the focus on the English language. But you might say, surely just changing the particular words you're using won't fool most people. A rose by any other name is just as sweet and all that, right? Well, I wouldn't be so sure that if used in the right context, simply swapping the words you're using can't be extremely effective. I think the reason for the effectiveness of thesaurus arguments is primarily the people's ignorance of the ideas which they've labeled as toxic and not worth discussing. If someone were extremely well versed in a subject to which they were opposed, then no amount of calling this rose by another name would fool them into changing their opinions. For instance, an expert on communism who is opposed to communism could never be taken in by somebody attempting a thesaurus argument, trying to convince them that communism is good. Try though they might to relabel it collectivism or meritocratic distribution or something, the expert is always going to recognize the underlying idea, regardless of what it's being called. But now imagine someone who is ignorant to the details of communism, yet is still superficially opposed to the idea. Maybe a better dead than red country type. Now he may balk if someone tries to discuss implementing communism in his country, but would be much more likely to discuss the ideas of collectivism or meritocratic distribution. The ignorant are susceptible to thesaurus arguments because their lack of understanding means they oppose only the word, not the ideas the word is supposed to represent, which they do not understand. This ignorance allows politicians and media pundits to get away with thesaurus arguments all the time. To name just a few of the more famous examples of the recent era, low-income housing has recently become affordable housing, a new term which does away with the negative connotations people have with low-income housing. For another example, there are people who wish for the abolition of private gun ownership, but who call their platform common sense gun control, adding the term common sense to make it more appealing. Food stamps, once full of negative connotations, are now called EBT, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program vouchers. And of course, sex, that characteristic which nobody in their right mind believed to be mutable, was called the less definite sounding gender, and now it's considered to be something entirely different by large portions of the population. Alright, so what of it? You say politicians in the media may use wordplay to push their ideas, but what else is new? Well, the point I want to get across in this video is this, that we ought to use this technique ourselves. We ought to use it in our everyday lives when talking to friends and family, and perhaps especially if you're in a position which is at all political. You may think this idea in and of itself is cowardly, and that we ought not to engage in this type of wordplay, but I wouldn't look at it that way at all. The way I see it, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of words which have been made artificially toxic by politicians and media figures who wish to silence any potential discussion around these topics before they even begin. Now, simply using these words guarantees the average person will not listen to your ideas at all. Now, what do I mean when I say artificially toxic? How do I distinguish this from the other toxic words which I've been discussing? I would say that a word should be considered artificially toxic when the people who find these words toxic, the ones who are unwilling to discuss them, are completely ignorant to the underlying ideas the word is supposed to represent. So low-income housing, for instance, could be said to have developed negative connotations quite naturally, given their being associated with increased crime rates and lower housing prices. These are facts that people often have first-hand experience with, and so someone wanting to refer to them as something else makes perfect sense. A word made artificially toxic can be considered a word which represents an idea about which people are mostly or entirely ignorant, and where their hate of the word comes from repeated propaganda, memes, and news stories, things like that. I'll give more examples of these types of artificially toxic words below. Basically, going forward, I suggest that we all be more cognizant of these artificially toxic words in our discussions, and rather than avoiding the conversations altogether, that we simply label them something else, something equivalent, but distant enough to bypass these filters which have been installed in our society. You may think that this is some sort of a subversion, and in a way it is, but it's only a subversion of an already developed subversion in our political landscape. So for an example, going forward in your discussions, you should avoid using the word degenerate, and instead talk of the country's moral fiber. Want to discuss the deep state without people assuming that you're crazy? Why not call them career politicians or unelected officials making huge decisions? You could even discuss fascism if you wanted. Given how much ignorance there is about what the word even means, all you need to do is use different words, and the average person will have no idea what you're talking about because they don't know the first thing about the particulars of fascism. But they have been inculcated with a strong, visceral hate of the word. In any case, I think the most foolish thing we can do at this point is to refuse to utilize the strategies of the enemy. There is an extreme danger in refusing to recognize the merits of your enemy, just as there is an equal danger in not recognizing your own shortcomings.